to SQL Friday. This is SQL Friday number 33, and our star today is Geovanny Hernandez. I'm sure I mispronounced that, so I did my best anyway.
Yeah. You did it very well.
So this time I have a star who is in the same time zone as me, more or less. He's in Spain. We have had all the way from Australia to Texas, so it's quite a big span. But for Geovanny, it's a decent time of the day to do a presentation. For Mike Bird, who stood up 4 o'clock in the morning to do a presentation from Texas, it wasn't as nice. But I'm very happy to have Geovanny here, who is going to talk about SQL Server on Linux. Geovanny, the stage is all yours.
Okay, thank you, Magnus. Let me to share the screen first. Okay, perfect. 1 second. Okay. First of all, thank you everyone for attending this session, and a special thank to Magnus for giving me the opportunity to be a speaker in this great project, which is SQL Friday. This time, as I told Magnus at the beginning of before to begin the session, I am feeling that I am crossing the border because I will talk about Linux, which is not so much common in this SQL Server world. But well, we are here, and let me just start with my presentation about first step to go ahead with my Microsoft SQL Server on Linux. About me, my name is Geovanny Hernandez. I am a database engineer and Microsoft certified. But basically, I consider myself as a person who loves the database, not only SQL Server. I have the opportunity of being working with other relational database as MySQL and with NoSQL just now as Cassandra and Redis too. So before to start to talk about the agenda, which I try to be very concise and to address, for me, the most important first step that we need to go when we enter into the SQL Server on Linux, I want to comment that in my website, let me to share quickly. I have posted the content of this session. You can visit geohernandez.net in the speaker event. We have here the first step in this session. I upload yesterday the same presentation that I am doing here together with the source code. So forget about how to wait time for this being published. This is available. If you can go to my website, you can download and follow him during this session. Okay, let me to return right now to the presentation. So this is one of the first questions that arrived to my mind some time ago. Why SQL Server on Linux? And I remember that I have a conversation with another colleague that told me, why not before? What I mean, probably the people that has been involved in the IT world during the last 10 or 15 years have been hear about this typical discussion about what is better, Linux is better than Microsoft, or Microsoft, or Windows, sorry, and Microsoft hates Linux and this kind of thing. The reality that some years ago, this kind of classic topic has changed of direction, especially because the introduction of Microsoft Azure has changed completely the rule of the games, especially because they realized, the Microsoft people realized about how much important was to adopt some of the most important Linux implementation for the own success of Microsoft. So this is for me, the most important part is that basically they are adopting and adapting many components of the Linux world for their own convenience. And at the end of the story, as the result of this, we have SQL Server on Linux, which is very interesting. In fact, the first version of SQL Server on Linux was the version 2017, which include many amazing features. Normally, I remember to read some time ago a very interesting book of Bob Ward about SQL Server on Linux. Bob Ward is a person who worked in Microsoft, and he knows in detail different aspects about the implementation of SQL Server. So he basically said in his book that the code base for SQL Server is exactly the same in in Linux that we have in Windows, but it's not a native implementation. What does mean? That improve the portability, the Microsoft people decide to put a kind of intermediate layer and not being SQL Server native. But at the end of the story, this was a great benefit for Microsoft from the perspective that right now we don't have only the option of having SQL Server on Windows or Linux. Currently, we can have even in Docker, and this is very important part of the story. If you ask me about which is better, at the end of the story, SQL Server will not be faster or slower in dependency of the operative system. The reality is that at the end of the story, this aspect about the speed and about performance will be exactly the same. So why Linux or why SQL Server on Linux? Basically, the Microsoft people said for giving to the user option or a choice, which is very interesting. Why? Because right now, the majority of companies, at least this is from my experience, they don't have only one database in SQL Server, for instance. Normally, we will find a lot of different database, NoSQL, SQL, MySQL, Postgre, a lot of options. And many of these options currently are running on a Linux wall or in Linux servers. So at the end of the story, it's an option. What I mean with this, that if your SQL Server installation is running on Windows and you don't have any other database more than SQL Server, why you want to move to Linux? And so this kind of detail is important that we think about it before to decide to move or not. So sorry for that introduction, but I think that normally is very good to think before to enter in this kind of unuseful discussion about which is better or what is not better. So Linux has many interesting aspects, but probably the first aspect that you need to address when you start with Linux is to choose which option or which distribution or distro you will have to take. For example, we start with Red Hat Linux, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, we have Ubuntu, or we have SUSE. These three Linux version or Linux distribution, all of them are supported by SQL Server. For this session, I will only explain and do demo related with Red Hat and Ubuntu. With these two OS, we will be covering around the 80% of all the market in terms of that these two distributions of Linux are the most used in the world. And at the end of the story, this is the distribution of the Linux distro that we have. You can see, for example, that this is something called the family branches. At the end of the story, OS as Red Hat or CentOS, both of them are coming from Fedora, or in the case of Ubuntu, of Debian. So the first question that probably you ask me is, okay, which version I should choose and why? Well, it depends. I know that this sounds like the classic answer in SQL Server. Well, it depends, but it's real. It depends. For example, if you're starting to work in Linux and your company is using Red Hat Linux, for me, not much option. At the end of the story, you will spend 8 hours every day in your work, and probably is for you is most useful to have the option to start with Red Hat Linux. Or, for example, if your company is using Ubuntu, okay, Ubuntu is a good option. At the end of the story, the statistic said that the majority of enterprise servers currently are using Red Hat or CentOS. And for the majority of desktop users, they are using Ubuntu. So at the end of the story, it's your option to choose which OS is more convenient. This graphic, the credit is for Philip Kirkbride, and I recommend this book, Basic Linux Terminal, for starting to play with Linux.
Geo, could you minimize the Teams output with my mugshot in it? So
okay. Okay, perfect. Right now?
Thank you.
Okay.
Perfect.
You're welcome. Perfect. So right now, in this slide, you can see some of the basic commands. But a part of this list of commands, I am writing a series dedicated to basic command in Linux for SQL Server Professional. So in my website, you will find some of these commands explained in a very simple way at the end of the story. So let me to start with the first demo about some interesting aspect. For example, I will start with Linux, and later let me explain you more detail about my configuration. So probably the first thing that you need to learn, this is a must, when you enter in the Linux, is that you will have to memorize many commands if you try to feel comfortable working on Linux. Sorry, but forget about GUI and visual or any kind of visual tool. The most important part here is to work directly with the commands and try to use in the best way. So, for example, when you start to enter in your console, the first thing that probably you will need to do is, where are you? So you have the command pwd, which show you in which directory or folder you are. This is the simple kind of command that you should know. And for example, every user that has permission to enter in a specific Linux server console is recognized into a home directory, and after the slash, you have the name of your user. In my case, Azure. Okay, but for example, Magnus can be Magnus or whatever user that was configured. Okay, so for example, if I want to list all the file that I have available in a specific directory, you can do a simple ll, which show you basically the content of this directory. For example, my file, sample, and the kind of permission that has been assigned to this specific file and who is the owner of this file. Let me explain later about root. And for example, here, let me to create a new directory. And do an L. Can you see quickly that it has been created? And with this, okay, perfect. I can start to save information in this directory. But before to do this, we need to move to this directory. So we have the cd. The cd command basically allow us to move from different location. So let me to do a cd space my directory, and currently let me to do a ll. Okay, 05, which is the expected result. And if I do a simple pwd, it show me what is my current location. This is the kind of basic first step that you need to start memorizing for your own welfare. So let me to do a simple movement. For example, currently I am in my directory. If I do cd cd space point, and let me to do a pwd again. Okay. If you see, I basically move to the root directory that I was before. Let me to move again to cd my directory. Okay, pdwd. Okay, basically where I am. And for example, if here I decide to go to the home pdwd with the use of caret cd space caret, I can sorry, not caret, with the tilde cd space tilde, I can return to the home, in this case the home of my own user. So this is the kind of basic command that I recommend that you start to working quickly. It's basically a group of instruction that, starting with this, we will have enough confidence to work more in advance with other kind of options. So let me to return to my presentation. And we will continue with the process of SQL Server on Linux. So this is the kind of no restriction, but the minimum setup that we should have in our laptop or in our server before to start to configure a SQL Server. My recommendation, this is only my recommendation. I have an Azure account, but you can use VirtualBox too. In my case, a part of VirtualBox, I have an Azure subscription, and I, for example, for this demo, I prepare in advance two basic virtual machine, which is a very cheaper option if you compare, especially because you can turn off one time that you have completed. MOBA is an application which allow us to connect directly in a secure way to every Linux server that we have. It's free too. If you let me show you, for example, here, this is the application that I will be using during the rest of this presentation for connecting to my different virtual machine. Okay, let me continue. Okay, installing SQL Server on Linux. In this part, I want to explain you that we have to start with Red Hat. Later, I will explain you step by step with Ubuntu and Core. Basically, Core is a standard application, which is very, very interesting and was designed to allow us to transfer data between servers without user interaction. During the installation process of Linux in Red Hat and Ubuntu, we will be using Core. And let me to explain you the basic command about this great tool. Okay, let me to return here to Red Hat Linux. Okay. For example, you can see that I did a watch space ls. This is a kind of way to avoid that the system freezing. For example, if you need to move during a specific period of time and you don't want that the application close for the lack of activity, watch ls is a very interesting option. The other thing that when I need to cancel the current command, you do a Control-C and you can return. For example, here you have seen a lot of interaction, but if you want to clean, you have two options. The simple is Control-L, or simply write the word clean. Okay, so let me to start right now with the explanation, about Core. The first part, with cur, after that you write the word cur, the -o basically allow you to save or store the output of the result. In this case, imagine that we are connecting to a specific website, this specific website, HTTPS, to download the repo. Let me just explain later about repo in Linux. So with this option, basically, I am telling that the result of this execution, which will download a repo file, need to be stored here in this specific directory. Okay. We have another option that you probably will see during the demo, which is this. In this case, I do add cur to a specific repo location in the Windows, in the Microsoft repo, and I am using the T command. What it does, basically, it receives as an input the result of the previous command and storing this result in a file called MySQL Server repo into this specific directory. Here I want to stop and explain you a very, very interesting feature that is part of the Linux ecosystem. Is something called the pipe, which corresponds to this symbol. Normally, in Linux, you can execute one command, but imagine that you need to do something with the result of this command. So you can redirection, or you can pipeline or build a pipeline of the result based on the use of this command. Let me to do a simple example. If I do a cur here, with this simple cur, it will download the repo file. This is the output of this command, the cur. But after this, with the symbol pipe, it recognizes that this output will be the input for the next command. In this case, the next command is the command T. So in this way, I am doing two actions with one simple definition throughout the use of redirection using this pipe command. This is very important aspect of the feature of Linux, because you will see during this session in multiple places where I use this technique. Okay. Okay, let me to continue here with the proper installation of live demo. Okay, it's demo time. Let me to start with the installation of SQL Server on Red Hat. Okay, so the first thing. Okay, sorry. Here. The first point about repo. Normally, for all the people that it's coming from Windows world, normally for us it's simple to install any new software. We download normally a package and click, neck, and we almost completed with this. In the Linux world, it's not so simple. What I mean with that, that we have to advance and we have to prepare the repository as the first point to do. What I mean, software in Linux distribution use package, and there are several package management systems, and this package management system are a collection of utility used to install, upgrade, and configure and remove package. At the end of the story, this is good because we can apply a specific policy and allow some specific user to have the possibility to install software in our server. And at the end of the story, it's a clean way of uninstall in the future. So the first command that I am executing here is a cur. I am basically download from Microsoft the official repo, and I am basically create a specific file into the YAM repos D. For the case of Red Hat Linux, the official package management that normally the people use is YAM. Okay, for this reason, I decided to do this session and show you how to install Linux on SQL Server for both systems. Because in the case of Ubuntu, we have to use another basically management system, another package management system. So in the first part, let me to do this, and what I have done, basically, I download the official repo config file from Microsoft and install it in this location in yum repos.d. Internally, Linux recognizes that every file that is inside this location corresponding to the to a repo. Okay. Another important aspect that I want to explain you is about security. Normally, for installing software or the configuration of software, you need to have permission. It's very common that when you connect to the, for example, to the documentation of Microsoft, they show you this kind of detail. If you, for example, Ubuntu, they put this kind of instruction to installing a SQL Server, and they always start with sudo su, which means sudo su. Or let me to explain initially, which means sudo at the end of the story. Sudo is a Linux command that enables you to execute a command as another user or as the super user or root. Root or the super user is God. In the Linux world is God. You can do whatever that you want with root. For this reason, when I do a sudo su, can you see here that I have my user and the alias that I decide for the installation of my virtual machine. But after that, I do a sudo su, immediately it changed to be the root. But in general, it's not a good practice that you start to installing software with root, because in theory, once that you have completed all the super admin task, you should close. Close is simple like exit. After that, I did an exit. You can see that I returned to Azure user. But what happened? For many reasons, the people can forget to disconnect or to exit, and we could execute some specific command for mistake, and we will have big problem. So at the end of the story, it's very common that you see in even in Microsoft this kind of syntax sudo su, and start to continue with the instruction for installing specific software in Linux. But it's not a good practice. This is the equivalent to do a select star in SQL Server world. So my recommendation is to first start all, if you are not the sysadmin in your server, to ask the sysadmin to give you the right permission for executing administrative tasks, for example, installing SQL Server and this kind of thing. And when you have this permission assigned to your user, you should do simple sudo. With the sudo, it recognizes that it will act as a kind of a super user, but only under the context of the specific command that you are using. What it means that if you simply do, for example, like in this case, sudo core, I am only presenting my golden ticket, which is the equivalent to the sudo, for this specific action. So in the next kind of action that I execute, I need to explicitly do a sudo if I want to execute with as a super user or as a root context. So this is the main reason, and this is something that for me is very important that you remind, because will be very common that you see in website like the Microsoft website this kind of thing and in many books, but the reality that is better is the rest of is the best is that you start your journey on Linux with good practice in advance. So let me to continue with the second step. Okay, first of all, I basically create the download the official Microsoft repo for SQL Server. I move to a specific recognized location in jam.repos.d, and right now I will install. For the installation of any software that you previously had download, any package, you have to do a jam install. The -y is for not asking anything. It's the equivalent to yes, and let me to do an enter. So right now, it is installing all the package associated with SQL Server, and here a very important aspect, it download and installing the reference or the other kind of software that it need to install to. So can you see has been taking some minutes in some time. It depends of the, in this case it depends of the feature of your server. So let me to wait some minutes. In reality, if you compare with other operating system, at the end of the story, Linux, I have to recognize is very fast operating system. And the other positive part is that you have the control in many aspects of your OS. Okay, it's almost complete with the installation. Okay. Oh. Okay. Let me wait. Always the last part probably is taking a little more time than expected.
It always takes twice as long when you do a demo as well.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a must. Okay. Let me to. Oh, no, this is not work because I will talk with you about other aspect related. Okay, it's almost finished. But to avoid spending more time, let me to move quickly. At the end of the story, probably we have to wait some second. Let me to move quickly. If you decide to use Azure, for example, this is a simple example. In virtual machine, you have the possibility of take an image. This is the classic infrastructure as services, and you can see right now the different version that we have of the different operative system. For example, for Red Hat, for CentOS, for Ubuntu. This was the option that I used in previous day for installing and prepare this demo. Let me to return here. Okay, basically it has complete, and we are. I couldn't take note about how much time it took, but normally 1 minute or 2 minutes. Obviously, in a demo, this time is like forever. Okay, let me to do the next step. So right now it's installing, but we need to do the setup. What is the setup in this case? Basically, with the installation, the previous step, it generate it download, not download, but it move a specific package to the default directory for every installation. The equivalent to program file in the Linux world will be the /opt. This is the slash is opt, and after that, in this case, the software that we have installed. So in this case, we do a sudo as a good practice, and finally a setup. After that, you click in there, You have the equivalent. Remember when you are installing in SQL Server in Windows that we have evaluation. We have exactly the same option here. Only for this purpose, I will choose the option 2, developer, and it always require a specific uh, system administrator password. Okay, I will. We will use this in the coming part. Okay, has been completed. So let me to verify. For checking if our service is already running and if everything is okay, we have two options to check this. Let me to show you the first. Remember at the beginning of the session when I told you about the redirection. This is a simple example. PS is the stand for process status. The minus E and F basically is telling to Linux, okay, I need that you show me all the process and all the extra columns that are part of this information. This PS minus EF is the equivalent to something that you know in MySQL, sorry, that you know in Windows, which is the task manager. This is the equivalent, basically. So, but after this command, we have a pine. What does it mean? That the output of the process status command will be the input of the next command. In this case, the command grep. In the second or third slide, I show you some description about grep. But basically, imagine this grep like the equivalent to a search. It's basically an utility that help you to filter information based on a regular expression or an expression. In this case, SQL. What is the result? Well, basically, let me here. It shows you the information about process corresponding to SQL that are running right now. It's not so most interesting, not very useful like task administrator, but well, wait. Here, basically, always it said that we have the main process, the parent process, and a child process. This is the information that we have, and how much time it has been running. In this case, 9 seconds from the point that I send the information. This is a simple option that you probably will see in different contexts. But to be honest, for us, it's more simple to use the next. 1 second. System CTL status. Because it's a standard, it's recognized even in Red Hat as in Ubuntu. So, and after the status, I need to see what is in this case, the name of the service. The service is MC SQL Server. And here, okay, look better. Here I can see the status. The status is active, and it shows you how much time it has been running. 3 minutes, 5 seconds ago, and show you more detail about the information related with the Microsoft SQL Server service. So my recommendation is always to use systemctl status, but I wanted to show the previous option because it's valid too. But obviously, for me, it's more comfortable to check the status with this option. Okay, so in this point, we have right now, we have our server, SQL Server installed and running, but probably we want to do a little more thing with this. So the first point is that right now we couldn't connect to SQL Server here in Linux because we need to download the client package. So for this reason is that we are using something that you know. The only difference is that I had to go to another specific repo for download this this library, the customer, the client library. Okay. One second. Download. And I need to set up. Okay. So have you seen that we always follow a very standard? We create the proper repo, download and save this repo, and after that we install and in some time configure. So right now let me to install the proper tool for can connect to our server. Okay. Okay. Very faster, very fast. Is so in this point we have our in this case our client ready. So let me to check if in reality it's ready. Okay. Okay. So let me to connect or try to connect locally. For connecting locally, you simply use SQL CMD, which is something that probably you used in the past. And I basically told him, okay, I need to connect using SQL CMD minus U, which is the stand for the user, and the name of the user in this case, the system administrator user. So right now I am inside SQL Server. So let me to verify if in reality I am inside SQL Server. I will do a simple select version query and I go. And boom, yeah, we are inside SQL Server in Linux, which with this version and this detail about the specific version that we have. So in this point, we are happy because we have our proper installation of SQL Server on Linux. And to abandon this CMD interface, you only need to do a Control D, and we return to our previous window, our previous command line in Linux. So what else? Well, the next and final step consists in the Azure Data Studio. This is my recommendation. I know that the majority of us probably starting with Management Studio, but one of the great benefits of Azure Data Studio is that you can perfectly work with this tool in Linux and Macs and in Windows. So in this case, only let me to choose Red Hat Linux, for instance. Okay, and it will not work. And this is part of the thing that I want to explain you. Why is not work? Because in the case of Red Hat Linux, we need to enable the firewall. Red Hat Linux has this kind of security feature, and before to have the option to connect, we had to enable the port 1433 before to try to connect outside of the server. Obviously, in the past, no problem because I was inside the server, but right now, if I try to connect, I couldn't. So for this reason, only for Red Hat Linux, you have to enable this port. Basically, here I want to only mention quickly this option. When you use this symbol, the ampersand symbol, you have the possibility to execute two commands in the same line. After that, you execute this success, and let me to try to return to here. Okay, this was the error that I received previously because I couldn't open the connection. So let me to try to connect right now. because right now I have opened the port, and voila, we have our database ready. We can start with do a simple query, and I could simply create Red Hat DB. And I have my first database created in Red Hat Linux. I know that we are. I have not so much time for Ubuntu, but don't worry, because I have experience with this, and I will try to go or to advance so much quickly as possible. And with this, we have completed the process of configuration and installation of SQL Server Linux in Red Hat. So for Ubuntu, the situation is not so much different. The only main difference that you need to take in account is that for the case of Ubuntu, instead of using YAM, the package management in this case is apt. So let me to start quickly with Ubuntu. Okay, Ubuntu has another interesting aspect related with the installation of package, and is the possibility to generate a kind of trusted connection. What it means? Here, with the apt key command, I am telling to the, in this case, to the Ubuntu server, okay, you will accept the downloads and package coming from Microsoft, because basically this core download, in this case, a security key. So when you do this, perfect. From now in advance, you will not have any kind of issue related to download package from Microsoft, because it will be recognized as a trusted site. Okay. Let me to advance quickly with the other case. If you see, it's more or less the same. I do a cart, but obviously the difference is that in the previous example with Red Hat Linux, I moved or I use Red Hat Linux configuration. For the case of Ubuntu, you have to choose the Ubuntu package, which can be available in the Microsoft website. For the rest of the thing, it's the same, with the only difference that instead of using a YAM folder, I am using an apt folder, which corresponds to the package management system in Ubuntu. Let me do, okay, perfect. Let me to advance quickly with the other command. In this point, I will do an update. This is probably another little different. In the case of Ubuntu, we always try to do a simple update after that you download and register a repository. And after that, I do an install of Microsoft SQL Server. Right now, it downloads all the information that it needs in case that is something pending. And internally is pre-configured and download all the information that you need to installing SQL Server. You can see, in fact, the unpackaged Microsoft SQL Server. To avoid losing time or wasting time, meanwhile we are download, the rest of the time it will we only need to wait some second or some minute. But let me to advance with the presentation, and in this way we can save time. Obviously, right now is with Ubuntu, but this is something that you need to take in account every time that you're connected to SQL Server. The first is, if you are using a virtual machine in Azure, corresponding to the inbound security rules, you can find a lot of information about it in the website, and there is nothing outside of the wall. It's a simple UI for configure. In this case, the SQL Server service is the most simple. But obviously, this is the kind of configuration for your own use. if you are interested in prepare the configuration SQL Server on a real production server, obviously you need to review in detail aspect about the security and about the configuration aspect that unfortunately are out of the scope of this session. Well, in this case, in our I had doing the first installation in Red Hat Linux, and I could create a simple example database that you can query as normal, as if you were in Management Studio working with your local instance of SQL Server. Okay, it has completed here. No more detail. Let me to advance. We find. Okay. Oh, sorry. I skipped one step. Okay. Starting with the proper installation. If you see the same command that we used previously for the case of Red Hat Linux. Okay, we have to choose the license. In this case, developer 2. The password. Okay. And it will continue with the configuration of SQL Server. Okay. Let me to return. Perfect. So at this point, instead of trying to connect it locally, I will check the service. Always I recommend, especially after that you have completed one specific installation, that you verify that the service is, oh, sorry. Oh. Okay. So right now, I can check that my service is running, is active, and everything is okay. So the rest of the steps are basically the same that you can see previously, related to the configuration of the production tool for connecting. Let me to install in this case, the package for the customer user. And let me try to connect locally, exactly in the same way that we do before. Let me do exactly the same select version. Go. And finally, we have Ubuntu installed correctly here in our Ubuntu service. If I move directly to the Active Directory, sorry, to the Azure Data Studio, I am available to connect to. And I can perfectly create a new query and Ubuntu DB. Okay, refresh. And we have. Okay. So in this point, we have created, installing, and deploy our first SQL Server instance on Linux in two distros, in Ubuntu and Red Hat Linux. Results. We are almost finished with the session. My recommendation is to these two books, Pro SQL Server on Linux from Bob Ward and Alt Linux of Benjamin Nevares. The changes respect to SQL Server 2019 with which the current previous respect to this book of Benjamin Nevares are minimum. So you can feel comfortable with starting with Linux. In fact, I recommend that they start with the Benjamin Nevares book first. And you have a very, very interesting course in Pluralsight about Linux administration fundamental. So I invite you to advance with this. And thank you for your time and passion. And basically, you can find me in my Twitter, and you can send me an email directly, and I will try to answer you as soon as possible. As I explained you at the beginning, I really like to help the people. And if you have any kind of doubt with SQL Server or Linux or Cassandra or another kind of database, I will be happy for help you. Okay, let me to stop the share the screen and return the control to my friend Magnus.
Thank you, Joe. And I agree about the book. The Navarro's book was the one that I started with when I started with SQL Server on Linux too, so it's a good one. Thank you so much. I don't see any questions in the chat, so if you guys who join the meeting, if you have any questions, just type them in the chat. We'll wait a minute or two and see if anything comes in. And if not, I just want to say thank you for spending an hour with us and showing us about some Linux and some SQL on Linux.
Okay. Don't worry, if no question, okay. Always you can send me email in case that you need more detail. As I told you at the beginning of the session, in my website you can download the whole this command that I posted or that I worked during the session are available in my website in the presentation link. And thank you, Magnus, for the opportunity of being a speaker in this great group. And well, thank you very much and have a great day.
Thank you. So, I see that I messed up my own camera here, but I'm going to fix that later. I made myself completely transparent. So I think it's really useful. I think everyone actually needs to learn some Linux because even if you're not going to run a Linux virtual machine or a Linux machine to run SQL Server on it, you will run SQL Server in containers, and in the containers you will run Linux containers because there is so much more lightweight than a Windows container will ever be. So it's for everyone. Every DBA needs to know a few Linux commands, and they need to understand a little bit about SQL Server on Linux. So, because I highly doubt that a Windows installed SQL Server will be the most common in 3 years, for example. I think
totally
containers is where we will go with everything. So.
Exactly.
Cool. I'm gonna. Let's see. Here we have a question. Have you tried a basic test of query speed of SQL Server on Linux and Windows? Definitely with the same resource.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I tested some months ago, and to be honest, I didn't notice a clue that told me, okay, there is a warning. Now, in reality, the kind of different are almost nothing. So, in not only my work, to be honest, Bob Ward, who is architect in Microsoft, mentioned this in the book. And I remember that for curiosity, okay, let me to try to see if there is something that is work. I use a tool called HammerDB for the testing. So if someone is interested, HammerDB is a really nice open source tool.
Yeah, no, and same goes for me. Actually, I haven't seen a big difference in performance. It's more or less the same, to be honest. So.
Yeah.
And then we have Jens saying, I think it's worth mentioning, when you enable the agent, you can use most of the Ola Hallengren scripts, and those from Brent, those are as well as SB who is active. So and that's true, because anything you can do on SQL Server, you can do on SQL Server on Linux. So if you have the SQL Server agent, well, then you can run anything that is T-SQL. It's very few differences in using SQL Server on Linux compared to SQL Server on Windows.
Yeah. With respect to the Herman comment, which is very useful about who is active, very not sharing, all Ali Green. I had to take a hard decision about if cover aspect about SQL agent or, for example, the installation of integration services. But at the end of the story, I wanted to show you how to configure in both in Red Hat and in Ubuntu. So I knew that not enough time to cover everything. So I had to decide. Okay, I prefer, because normally the majority of people or they have a Red Hat or they have Ubuntu. Okay, with this process of installing SQL Server on Linux, I will cover the most interesting aspect. But yeah, it's to probably in another session in future. This is all about to configure integration service to enable a SQL Server agent job in this kind of detail.
Yeah. Cool. I need to disconnect because I'm about to start a presentation on C# Corner's virtual SQL Server conference in half an hour.
Oh yeah, good luck.
Where I'm going to talk about DBA tools, and I will start with a demo on containers actually. So it's going to be a little bit about running Linux containers in Docker for Windows. So a little different, but a little the same too. So, but thank you so much for coming to SQL Friday. I will do my best in editing the recording and get it up during the weekend. So I will ping you on Twitter so you see when it's up to you.
Thank you very much. Enjoy the weekend and good luck, Magnus.